call Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, there's so many things to say. I'm going to start off my contribution in the committee stage addressing Clause 1 with talking to the history of the Telecommunications Development Levy and the legislation within which it sits, which passed in this House in 2011 with a vote of 65 to 52. And one of the most interesting things about that vote was that the ACT Party, which then had 5 members in the House, split their vote. And 3 voted against and 2 voted in favour. And the 2 that voted in favour were the 2 that had been sitting through the select committee process for the whole time. Mr. Speaker, that piece of legislation split Telecom in half. It was structural separation. Now, the Labor Party did not oppose that. We did not oppose that at all. The person sitting on my left is the Minister of Communications who brought in the legislation for operational separation of Telecom. So we did not oppose that. What we opposed was the process and the way that, and the setting up of a monopoly for a monopoly which is now called Chorus, which was set up to be handed over on a plate, the contract for the ultra-fast broadband project. And we opposed that implacably, and we opposed the way it was done, and we opposed that the concessions and handouts that they were given along the way to do that. And that Chorus has now become the monopoly provider of 60% of the rollout of ultra-fast broadband, at the same time as being the monopoly that has the copper network, which sits alongside that, and that has continued to provide problems. In that legislation was the establishment of the Telecommunications Development Levy. Now, Labor didn't oppose that part of the legislation. We never opposed that because we knew the benefits of providing a fund that was provided by the industry for the provision of services that couldn't be got through the market. And this is, as my colleague over here talked about the market gap, there are many market gaps in this country with regards to the digital divide. There are market gaps within urban areas as well, with people who can't afford to access broadband, can't afford to access home phones anymore and use prepaid mobile phones, people who are disadvantaged, and particularly families with children, which is the biggest problem. Nobody could say that the Labor Party has not stood up for those people, and nobody could say that the Labor Party has not been the champion of closing the digital divide in this country, and has led the charge on that, and led the charge in that select committee that you referred to earlier around it, and has pushed and pushed around those issues. So nobody could say that. But that Telecommunications Development Levy, and by the way, everybody should remember that this was Stephen Joyce's baby. This was his brain. The brainchild of Stephen Joyce was to create this, which has caused so many headaches, ongoing headaches for the government. He created that legislation which set the terms for that levy to be reduced down to $10 million next year. Now, what the National Party and the minister sitting over there as a candidate for the election introduced 3 weeks before the election, out of the blue, was just to willy-nilly extend that levy, extend it, create a new levy, and come up with more money, because they knew, their market research was telling them, that there was a big problem in rural New Zealand because there were too many people getting crap broadband, and it was turning out to be a problem for them in their polling and in their market research. And so what happened? All of a sudden, we get 150 million, no consultation, no reports, no analysis. And interestingly, since the election, and it's now more than 6 months since the election, we still haven't seen any reports. There still hasn't been any analysis, and the regulatory impact statement admits it. It's embarrassing for MB, I have to say, that they've put out a regulatory impact statement which acknowledges that they haven't done the work. But what we've got is a levy which was supposed to go to $10 million, and now oh, it's up to 50 million. Now, I think my colleague David Parker made it clear that if, Mr Chair.
Mr Chair, Karen. Mr Chair.
Thank you. I think my colleague David Parker made it clear that if there had been a different process around this, if there had been full consultation around how to spend that $150 million, how to do that with the community, not just with the providers who are paying the levy, but full consultation about A, has the Rural Broadband Initiative worked? Okay, so which bits have worked, which bits haven't worked? And then, okay, so how could we do it better? And if they had done that in a way that had been, because we never opposed it at the time when it was made before the election, what we said was that it needed to be contestable, absolutely needed to be contestable and fair. Well, what we're seeing in the regulatory impact statement is that there could be capture by the big providers again, which is a rort, an absolute rort. This is why we're opposing it. This is why we are retaining our consistency of opposing something that is wrong. It's putting bad money after a good, what is something that is good and should be done, good money after a bad outcome. And we are terribly concerned about that. So, Mr Chair, I want to turn to a curious, my colleague Chris Hipkins, when he referred to the fixed wireless broadband and the terrible situation that is occurring out there. Well, what we've discovered, or what we think we've discovered, and this is one of my questions, or many questions that I have for the Minister tonight during this debate, is that there is some information around how many customers. This goes to the 8,500 customers on fixed wireless broadband, which looks as if it's cost around $7,000 per customer. Who are they? And who are the providers behind them? $7,000 per customer. I mean, that's a rough estimate, but it's just doing some basic maths. We have no other information to go on, Dr. Clark. No other information. There hasn't been any reports produced. Well, let's have a wee look at who those customers might be and who is doing the connecting. Well, Mr. Chair, the top provider, a self-described top provider actually, for the Rural Broadband Initiative's fixed wireless connections is a company called Farmside. And they describe themselves as that, and I've even got a piece of paper here which is which I'd be very happy to table if anyone wanted me to, which talks about how they have they provide fast broadband via satellite, RBI fixed wireless and fixed line solutions, as well as phone and mobile access. And they've got, they say they've got more than 15,000 rural customers. Well, that's really interesting because what I've heard is that they're transferring many of those customers over to fixed wireless broadband, which is fine in itself. But it might be interesting for the House to know that the Managing Director of Team Talk, which is Farmside's parent company, is David Ware, who is the
brother-in-law,
is the husband of Belinda Milne, who happens to be the Minister's sister. So it's curious. And Jason Eads' employer. Forgot about that. But I mean, the fact remains is that it's a little bit curious that Farmside, which describes itself as one of the top providers for fixed wireless broadband, which has got very few customers, and I think everyone would acknowledge that, given that they've had 5 years, spent $60 million, and now they've got 8,500 customers, which equate to about 7,000 each. Farmside, I think there's a really important issue here around transparency and around what actually is going on here with rural broadband. There are questions about how the money is being spent on the towers, and there are questions around what actually is being delivered out there for rural New Zealand. And so I say to the House tonight, and I say to anyone from the other parties who want to listen, is that there are some very, very good reasons to say, hang on a minute, let's not commit another $150 million to a program which is highly questionable, needs scrutiny, and let's take a pause. Absolutely committed to rural broadband and delivering that infrastructure and delivering it in the best possible way.
Mr. James Shaw.
Chair,